So, Charles, thank you very much indeed for coming along to this podcast. And now here's the thing. This is not your first with me. In
Mm.
fact, during a period of lockdown, we said, oh, we should do some podcasts. And you were the
Yes.
first person with whom I ever did that. It was one
Mm.
of the most engaging conversations I've ever had.
Well, thank
I
you.
really enjoyed it.
Thank
Um,
you very much. Good to be back. Nice to see you again, Tim.
Thank you. I then came slightly self-conscious and then kind of felt that people like Stephen Bartlett do far better podcasts and did nothing since.
Yeah.
And have
Well,
only recently kind of felt maybe I should go back and do this again
yeah.
and learn the craft a little more. So
Yeah.
it's a real delight to have you back. At
Thank
the
you.
time of
Thank you very
this, we
much.
were talking about our experiences with COVID and how being remote from the world or locked at home. And we talked
Mm.
about emotion and well-being. And we may well revisit some of that today. But
Sure.
one of the things I'm really interested about you is you're quite varied, or at least it seems that way. You know, you've done work in the Middle East, you've done work in Jersey and UK. You are a personal coach, but you work with corporates.
Mhm.
And when we first met during a thing called Man Club,
Yes.
you were writing a book.
I work in progress, but
Yeah.
I think COVID hit me down a bit because I got tied up with a variety of different things. And when you get excited about something and you start writing and you realize, oh my God, it's already been said.
Mhm.
And so much, there's so much out there. Why would I bother? And then you come to realize, well, maybe you have a different value to add or some different perspective which someone out there might need to listen to. So work in progress, but time has been quite scarce recently. But I think 2024 is the year I'm going to finally buckle down and
Mhm.
get on with it, because I've got the skeleton, so to speak. I just need to put the flesh on it and to make it whole. But yeah, and there's a lot of interesting research since then about it. So which makes it easier, I suppose. So
It's really interesting what you say about books. There are a number of really good local authors. I mean,
yeah,
surprisingly so. And I think people have a tendency to use books like business cards. You know, here I am. This is my book. Read about that.
I'm an author. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Which is great. And when some people have said to me, "Oh, Tim, you should write a book," I felt a little like you. What could I possibly write that hasn't already been written?
right.
I think in some respects that's partly what's motivated the podcast because I
Mm,
don't necessarily want to sort of regurgitate what I already know from books that I've read,
mm,
but actually to explore the world through conversation. I think that's really an interesting way of instead of living in my own head and what I think the narrative should be, and I put it on a piece of paper,
yeah.
is to explore that narrative of other people who may agree or may really disagree. And I think
Yeah.
it's the nature of those conversations that's motivated me to come back to podcasting.
Yeah.
And one of those people who really does provoke my thinking is you. I mean, very
Oh,
often you'll say
thank you.
things and I'll sit there and go, oh, I'm not sure how I feel about that. And I think, that's where growth is when people
Yeah.
throw challenging things at you and you pause to think in a respectful way. And you may or may not agree, but you're now aware of a different perspective. And I think that's great value.
Thank you. And I couldn't agree more, because I think through disagreeing and having different perspective is where we learn.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, society today is so hypersensitive and hyper emotional
Mm-hmm.
that people get triggered very quickly. Consequently, you duct tape yourself, and you end up censoring yourself and not speaking what you think and what's going on inside and your perception of things, and perhaps your critical thinking of the world. Because everybody's very quick to shoot you down and say, you're this, that, and the other, and judge, because it is a very, very emotional world. It's not as rational as it used to be. We've got increased emotionality, decreased in rationality, and you have to be very cautious. And I think I'm tired of being cautious. I'm in my 50s now, and I've reached a stage where you think, you know what? I don't need to be liked by everybody. And I don't need anyone's approval or validation. I've done that for myself. Thank you very much. But if I can be useful and add value to one lonely soul out there who's struggling with something, and let them know that you're not alone. there is a silent majority who think like you or struggle like you, and it's good to reach out and connect with them.
What you've just said has sent off little mental fireworks in my head. I can think of
Ooh, here
half a
we go.
dozen different
Buckle
directions
up,
we
folks.
could go in. So I'm going to throw a couple of questions at you,
I
and
thought you might.
I'm going to you pick one, and the one that you pick is the theme that we'll pursue next.
Fair enough.
So the first one, which is really interesting, is when you said, the world is perhaps more emotional than it's ever been. I wonder if it's hyper rational. I wonder if it's now so rational it's lacking any emotion. And the post office scandal has made me think about that. And we see loads of scandals where people do hyper rational things without actually emotional and connected awareness. But I think one of the other tangents that we could go on is your point about speaking out. You work with individuals and you work with corporates.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if sometimes the language, the feeling, the sentiment, the discussion is different when you're working with, say, a person in an organization context and working with the organization supporting their people. I think that's another tangent that we could go on. So I can think of others, but let's pick one of those two.
Oh boy. Well, I mean, going back to what you said, that we were over rational. I'm not sure I can entirely agree with that. I think you're right. We try to be very rational. Everything has to make sense. Everything has to be scientific, although the science these days is a little bit of a joke. And the narrative is quite different to what it used to be. Nevertheless, I think what I'm referring to with increased emotionality is that we live in a world where we are constantly hit tsunami after tsunami of information. It's information overload. And it's all coming to us via this constantly. Whether it's 4 a.m., you come back from weeing and you want to have a look at, what's going on. You're bombarded with images, film clips, sound, edited out of context content that is triggering, upsetting, which makes you suddenly have a very visceral response to things rather than have a moment to think about it, reflect, analyze, critically think, and then formulate an emotion or perhaps a response. So it's very quick and it's constant. And I think that's what I'm referring to with the increased emotionality of things. Everything is a crisis. Everything is a disaster. Whether it's COVID, whether it's Brexit, whether it's Boris Johnson, whether it's Trump, whether it's the inflation or the war in Ukraine, what's going on in different parts of the Middle East, whatnot. It's always constant. And everyone is in that state all the time. And, the conversations are very much, oh, did you hear about that? And it's doom and gloom. And, I always say drama is great on the stage and screen. Don't invite it in your life. It gets ugly. And unfortunately, everybody's lives these days, and I'm generalizing, I apologize for that. Most people's lives are infested with more drama than needs be.
I think that's interesting. I broadly agree with you, but I come at it from a slightly different angle.
Yeah, good.
As somebody who gets involved in projects and change, a phrase that I sometimes use with sponsors is, this project is effectively the stage on which people are acting out their dramas. And, the problems of the project or the change aren't necessarily to do with the project or change. It's just an opportunity for people to manifest their hopes and dreams and fears. And if they don't like something, your project will be the opportunity to demonstrate that they don't like something. And so very often, the presenting problem may be here, but the real problem, we know this through things like clinical diagnosis, and doctors will say, well, you feel the pain there, but that's referred pain. The real problem is actually somewhere else.
Yeah.
And I think that's true in organizations very often, and perhaps neglected. We deal with symptoms and quick fixes. And this idea of symptoms and quick fixes, this idea of 3 points to empathy, 10 things you should do this week, 5 things to be successful, 4 news items that you should be aware of, they may present themselves as emotional, but they're not. They're not emotional. We are being taught how to be empathetic. We are being prescribed how to do well-being. We are being told what is important. And that's what I mean by almost hyper-rational. We've actually, I think, lost the internal feeling of what's right or wrong, and we are consuming, recipes of ultra processed recipes, whether ultra processed food or ultra processed news or ultra
Yep.
processed emotion.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's what I mean by almost hyper rational. It's
Absolutely. I
now
accept that.
clinically
Absolutely,
sound.
entirely. Yeah. From what you've said, I completely agree with that, by the way. And I think the root, going back to the root, is that we have abdicated our sovereignty to think. We have outsourced it to what they say, whoever they are. I don't know who these people are, but the noise, the narrative, the rhetoric that's out there. And it's not necessarily what you want for your life. It's not necessarily what you want to live your life by, whether it is your values or what you believe in and what you've been raised by. And I think it's good to reclaim that and say, you know what? Okay, you're free to live and think and be the way you'd like to be, but it doesn't have to be the way I live my life. And I think having that difference is necessary and healthy, rather than having a narrative that forces us all to be in a uniform way. It's not going to work anyway, because we are individuals and every home has its own subculture compared to its neighbor. So having that freedom to be yourself within your own head is really important, because like you said, it's not just the food and drink that you consume. Everything that's going into your deep unconscious on a regular basis is also part of your diet. And a lot of it seems to be quite malnourishing, let's say, if you know what I mean. So it's important to filter your life and have the sovereignty to decide what's right for you. So let's look at it metaphorically as a diet. You know, they always say a high fiber diet is really good. You should eat a lot of leafy green vegetables and whatnot. I tried that, Tim. It bloated me and it gave me constipation, I'm sorry to say. However, a friend of mine whose diet is very much that works brilliantly for him, and he's lost weight and he's doing very well. So you have to know what works for you. Ibuprofen gives me heart palpitations. Paracetamol does not. Every body is different. Every digestion is different. Every processing of the world around you and your perception is different. And I think that difference is necessary, and we ought to preserve it rather than hit it with a sledgehammer and say everybody has to be the same, because it's very unhealthy, and it's formulating a variety of different social problems. I think mental health is one issue, but I think mental health as a whole is indicative of a societal problem, and that's a whole different can of worms we can go down if and explore if you'd like. But one of the big concerns I have about the world today is the epidemic of loneliness that has taken over. People have never been so lonely. You know, being the paleo ancestral beings that we are, our brains haven't changed in over 240,000 years. We're still the same cavemen and women. We are social animals, and it's necessary to connect. Because if you look at the ancient wisdoms for millennia, it always says break bread with a friend. It doesn't say send an emoji. So I think the connections we have today is light and dark. There's duality in that. We are connected. It's great that I can text my relatives abroad and stay in touch. But meeting them and having a meal together and sitting down and having a tactile interaction where we're hugging and kissing and laughing together is very, very different. So we are connected, but we're also malconnected. I think that malconnection has created this loneliness epidemic that Professor John Cacioppo of University of Chicago has written about extensively. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about.
I think one of the complex areas, and what I mean by a complex area is I'm not even coherent in my own thinking, is around goals and purpose. I mean, there's a great feeling that every organization should have a purpose and we can rally behind a purpose.
Yeah, great.
But actually, everyone's interpretation of that purpose may be different. And if in a sport context, because I work with athletes, you might turn around and say, what will we subjugate? We'll subjugate everything about our lives in pursuit of this one goal. Now, sport is relatively easy because you might say we're going to subjugate everything in favor of this goal for 22 weeks or 2 years if it's an Island Games or 4 years if it's Commonwealth or Olympic Games. So it's it's a microcosm and it's a short period of time. And then everyone will interpret that goal according to what they need to achieve,
Mhm.
strength, power, flexibility, but there's a unified goal. But your point about loneliness is really interesting because we could be in a position where an organization, a culture, society, or a community is prescribing goals for us to be successful, to be productive, to be meaningful, to have social impact. And then we feel lonely because we don't really identify with those goals. And
Right.
I don't think your caveman would have woken up every morning and said, I'm going to achieve this goal any more than a cat or a fish has an underlying objective for the next 3 years. Um, that type of survival, live each day, be a community doesn't have goals that are about amassing wealth or knowledge or power. And
Mhm.
I'm wondering if actually the idea that goals unify, I wonder to what extent they actually divide us.
I think goals have to start from the individual. I think I mean, are we talking about the corporate world or are we talking about the individual? Because
Well, I think that's really interesting because, of course, the corporate world is a collection of individuals, and
yeah,
yet they playing different music.
yes, I'll tell you why. And this is something I read a few months ago. I forget where. I think it was one of the papers. Um, when people go to work, it's no longer a place of work like it used to be 30, 40 years ago. You go, you clock your hours, you get your salary, you do your job, you go home, you have a family, you get on with your life. Nowadays, especially with the younger generation that have come into the workforce, they're looking for work to be your community, your
Mhm.
tribe, your village, your church, your synagogue, your mosque, your higher purpose. Everything has to have a higher purpose. We're doing good for the planet. It's great, wonderful. But ultimately, and I'm going to be really bold here, the primary purpose for a business is profitability. You're in a business to provide a service or a product and make a profit. That's the raw fact. Now, anything on top of that is garnish and it's nice. But I think companies nowadays are quite confused in the sense that what do we do if we want to minimize turnover? We want to attract talent. We need to give them, we need to fill the voids that they have in their lives, which is community, spirituality, something with meaning and purpose and a higher cause. And I think the intention might be well, the
Mhm.
strategy is not always necessarily effective. And I think on some level, it's the emperor's new clothes. I think what happens is you come back from work and you realize you are just an employee, and if the wind changes, you will be out on the street and you need to find another job because that it happens. It's a job. So there's a lot of gray area, but I think it also highlights how each individual in that company would benefit from looking into their lives and asking themselves, what meaning do I have?
Mhm.
What am I doing that makes my life meaningful in order to bear the uncertainty and the pain of life? And this is where I have a big problem with our industry,
Mhm.
coaches, therapists, wellness, self-help, and all that stuff. Um, for the past 30 years, we've had a diet of you should be happy, find happiness. Great. Well, if you're happy all the time, Tim,
Mhm.
you're wacko. Okay. The fact is, you cannot be happy all the time. Life is painful. It dents, it bruises, it scratches us all. It's not always a rainbow and sunshines, moonlight and martinis. And when it hits hard, and sometimes we have a glimpse of our own mortality,
Mhm.
you ask some very difficult existential questions as to what the hell is all this about? And it can be very depressing. So if you pour your energy to find meaning in your life or find something that gives your life a sense of purpose that's beyond just your needs, your temptations, your appetites, then it becomes a little bit more manageable. And I think Nietzsche said that if you find a why, you can bear almost any how.
Mhm.
Nothing you don't know, of course, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot out there that makes us remember these things to look and build a life that is a bit more meaningful, a bit more rich, so that we can handle it better and tolerate it better.
I think you're right, certainly about the business model, business about being profit and productivity. And I think that's, you know, the view has been post-Second World War that collaboration, profit, and productivity will actually provide peace, because if we all gain, then we're less likely to go to war with each other.
Yes,
And that served us
collectively.
for a decent amount of time. But there are victims of the global economy, and we're now starting to see that pretty much hit reverse gear with an increase in nationalism, a reduction in tolerance. And I'm wondering if that business model that we're here to be productive, to make money, to make profit, to pay our shareholders, I wonder if that's going to start going in reverse. Will we see the rise of more social enterprises? Will we the post office scandal, and frankly, there are many others. This is just the one that's in the popular conscience at the moment, is a manifestation of, the Eichmann thing. I was only following orders. The command was to do this. We did this. We did this with each of us following our very narrow view of what my job is, nobody taking a connected view, nobody taking accountability, everybody profiting from the tide rising.
Right.
Even though the tide was rising, the wealth was going, the awards were happening, and that rising tide was drowning people. But we just didn't listen. Now, that's a very localized, topical thing that maybe in 2 years' time, nobody will know what we're talking about.
Yeah, maybe in 2 months.
Certainly when we look across Europe, we're seeing that type of change, that political change. And I'm wondering if B Corps and social enterprise is the antidote.
Well, I'm reluctant to get into the political or perhaps even religious discussions for my own self-preservation, frankly, which I can understand. I'm sure you can appreciate that.
Yeah.
But looking at it from a macro perspective, yes, you will have pockets of issues like that. And no doubt there are pressures and tensions that are happening always, and they always have. But in the grand scheme of things, Tim, things have never been this good for us. The standard of living that we have, the quality of life that the majority have compared to the minority 50, 60, 80 years ago. I mean, 80 years ago, we had a huge malnourishment and starvation problem in the world. We don't anymore. Things have never been this good. And I think instead of focusing on tiny pockets of a few, it's good to look at the big picture and realize how far we've come, and experience a bit of gratitude, because that's another thing that's missing in the world today. I think the more we talk about it, the more we understand it, the better it is. I think the worst thing we could do is shut each other up because it's inappropriate or politically incorrect and this, that, and the other. I think we need to have more honest conversations and discuss the elephants that might be in the room, and work together with a bit more harmony rather than resentment. For years, the marketing industry has looked at how sex sells, and sex does sell. That is a given. It's hardwired in our system. It's evolutionary psychology. But what they've also discovered the last 15 years or so is that something that's even more responsive and emotive in us is rage. So if you enrage your public, if you enrage your audience with something or a piece of news or an image or a clip on social media, you are more likely to get a response, an emotive, visceral response, than anything else. And the more quiet we're forced to be, the more that's going to happen, with different sides fighting each other. One fuels the other. But again, I'm reluctant to go down the political debate, if you don't mind. But I'd like to look at the glass half full. We've come so far. Things have never been this good. With a click of a phone, I could purchase something. With a click of a phone, I can have the best meal, gourmet food delivered to my door. Convenience on tap, better health than ever. But there is something missing. And frankly, it's our malconnection to each other. We need to be a bit more tactile. We need to go back to what we're hardwired to be, humans, together, and exercise a little bit more critical thinking and have a little pause. One of my favorite punctuations is comma. The comma gives you a pause in a sentence or a paragraph. And it's important to introduce a little bit of comma in your own life, just to pause and have perhaps a digital fast for a few hours, just to step away from the madness and the noise and connect with yourself a bit more mindfully, so you can then live more purposefully. So
one of the things that provoked my thinking in a recent podcast is with Robert Roland Smith, and he made a lovely comment. It says, "Well, of course, we're living too long. You know, the human was not designed to live this long, and realistically, there's a real chance we might live to 100." Now, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but we were talking about reflection and philosophy, and I think you're right. I think there's a point where if we reach a level of comfort, we use all this extra time for internal analysis or philosophy or anxiety or rage. And I'm wondering, is it even possible to feel rage when you're just too busy thriving to exist? And rage is almost a gift that comes to us when we have enough time to actually turn our attention to that. Because if we're flat out busy existing, and this would be Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or it may be spiral dynamics, but this idea that this abundance of wealth and time and longevity is just creating a vacuum which we're filling with other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. Because I read somewhere that depression is a middle class disease. Mm-hmm. You know, if you're busy in sub-Saharan Africa trying to feed your family, you don't have time for depression or anxiety. Just get on with it because you have something to do. Mm-hmm. But yes, I agree. We have too much time on our hands. And I think, the number of hours we spend on social media looking at mundane nonsense, if we really are going to be honest with ourselves, is more than we ought to. Mm-hmm. And I think that invites its own problems rather than pouring our energy into something that's rewarding, healthy, necessary, a walk in nature, mm-hmm. a few deep breaths, connecting with friends over an activity that's, face to face rather than a click here and a click there. So it's a question of becoming self-aware of that and realizing that you are participating in that as well unconsciously, and reclaim it again and consciously decide to step away from it and pour it elsewhere. But yeah, time unfortunately is a luxury, that many don't have, and those who do are not pouring it and using it in the necessary avenues that they ought to be. It is a little too much where you pour your energies and you want to pick up a cause and be angry about, and all of a sudden you're an activist. Mm-hmm. Great. Fact is, things have never been this good. So instead of creating isms that are divisive, it's good to step away from that. And I think when we are purposeless and our lives don't have the meaning that they ought to have, we become more attracted to isms as a general rule. And I think that becomes tribal. It becomes more divisive in society. It's us versus them, men against women. We're not really talking to each other the way we used to. We're not relating to one another, having relationships the way we're used to. We're lonelier. Men are lonelier today. Suicide is the number one cause of death among men under 50. Women are also lonely. Everything is fragmented, mm-hmm. because we are listening too much, watching too much, rather than going back to what we're hardwired to be, which is human beings, conscious beings who can think, decide, and be more than just our feelings and emotions. And I think we're giving a little too much to that. It's good to be aware and look after your emotional health, which leads to your mental mm-hmm. health. But how much? At what point do you say, you know what, I'm okay. I don't just want to sit and overthink and look at the floor and have internal conversations with myself that just spiral down. Sometimes you just have to step away and say, I want to be more than just my feelings, and exercise a little bit of stoicism to walk away, step away, and regain that sovereignty that I referred to mindfully and purposefully live the life that you want rather than what's shoved down your throat. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I am reminded of something Matt Fuller said in one of my last podcast of 2023. He said, people will feel passionately about something at the keyboard, but they won't actually build a placard and walk down King Street.
Right.
And I found that a really interesting thought, that difference between being interested or outraged, and that motivation, that drive to actually go and do something about it. If you really are passionate about something, go and do something. Go and write a placard. Stand for politics. Stand for something you
Sure.
believe in. Form
Yeah.
a charity. I think there's a disconnect between thinking something and doing something. One of the things that I've observed recently, and this may be a segue to your work with organizations, is that very often if organizations are struggling to do the things that they want to do, whether they're goals, products, services, etc., okay, they'll put out training as if the problem was a lack of knowledge rather than a lack of commitment. Now, knowing something is not the same as doing something, and
Mhm.
therefore more information is not the antidote to inertia. And
Correct.
I find that really interesting. And I think when it comes to motivating employees, okay, or motivating people that we do as coaches and achieving organizational goals, which we can do as coaches,
Mhm.
there's almost two different narratives going on here.
Yeah. Um, Sometimes they want a band-aid, a little plaster for their wound rather than dealing with the infection that there might be in the organization. And I think a lot of times, that quote by Drucker, it says, Peter Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You might have outstanding strategies. You might bring in expert consultants and coaches who give you remarkable training and workshops. Now you're intervening with strategies and suggestions. But if the culture is rotten, if the culture is one that dampens everyone's spirit because it's toxic from the top down, it's never going to really materialize to anything. And I think if organizations will really want to take that on board and offer some kind of constructive shift to something better, they have to take a good hard look in the mirror from the top down and realize, what are we doing? What's the culture that we're ignoring to acknowledge here? What are we doing that's causing the rise in the turnover that we have? And I see a lot of organizations doing that. You have young talent who are coming, Gen Zs, Gen Y, remarkable brains, very fertile, very capable.
Mm.
But the working environment is so outdated that there's such a disconnect, and they're almost perfect seeds in a very poor soil, and it never really flourishes into anything more than that. So I think it's necessary to reassess where you're going, restructure if you need to, and implement it from the top down so that you become an example that people can look at and say, right, okay, things are really changing here. But to do that, you need courage. To do that, you need leadership. You have excellent managers, but you don't have enough leaders who are comfortable enough to do something difficult and challenging because they're afraid of being canceled, labeled, and replaced. So you have a culture in the world today where you're reluctant to speak the truth, reluctant to take some difficult decisions, which will have consequences, but everything you do or you don't do has consequences. So it's a question of valuing it and figuring out, how do I save this organization? How do I evolve it into something better to not only survive, but to thrive? And it comes down to fear. And you see it in politics in the world as well. Everyone's quite afraid to speak and say something, to do something of value that makes society a better place. So you see it across the board.
One of the things you spoke of about 15 minutes ago, and the reason I'm able to recite it is I thought, wow, that's a great phrase, is you talked about, every home has its own culture. So
Yeah.
if each home has its own culture, then the street will then have an aggregate of that, but then the town or the city or the nation. And so when
Right.
we talk about organizational culture, I mean, organizational culture changes when Martin leaves the room and Mary enters the room. The culture's changed in the room. That's a thing. So how is it that we can say there is one culture? Because culture is a function of the people that are in the room, the context in which they're there, and the task in which they're trying to do it. I certainly know I'm very different as a father to that which I am a rowing coach or a project manager,
Naturally, yes.
consultant or a therapist. I wear those different roles and I try and execute them differently. Otherwise, my family might be a little unhappy. So given that, given the fact that we have different roles, different contexts, different needs, different drivers, different relationships, the relationship with a father, a brother, a mother, an aunt, they're all going to be different, even if we ourselves are that unique us that has integrity.
Mhm.
How is it that leaders can actually form, direct, mold, set a culture?
Okay, it's a good question. Culture is a living thing. It's almost like a living organism that's constantly evolving and shifting and changing. And there are forces that change that culture, interventions that change that culture. And I'm speaking very broadly, of course.
Hmm.
I think the culture that a leader has to be concerned about is, what do I need to do from a macro perspective to make this organization function more efficiently in a
Hmm.
lubricated way? Uh, and perhaps cultivate an autonomy that each department can then have its own subculture, so long as it's congruent with the
Hmm.
culture that I'm dictating from the top down for the greater good.
Hmm.
So the leader has to focus on the macro,
Hmm.
and each unit then can focus a little bit more on their micro. So let me put it this way: there's a bank I worked with years ago,
Hmm.
and they had their mission statement, vision, mission, and all that stuff on the wall, and the values. But there was one particular branch which was getting applications for transfers to be transferred to, by the way. So many other branches were trying very hard to transfer to this particular branch. And the reason was the branch manager was such a wonderful leader and manager of that branch that the culture that she had created within that branch was delightful,
Hmm.
pleasant, loving, kind. And lo and behold, they always met their targets and exceeded them.
Hmm.
So within a bank that was doing such a great job, you had one branch, maybe two, that were surpassing anybody's expectations because of the two managers within each branch that had created such a fertile, wonderful, family-oriented vibe that people said, you know what, when I come here, it's not work anymore. I'm with my family, my second family. And that in a way highlights how you have the macro idea of what the bank should do.
Hmm.
And then within that, you have a couple of micro examples of outstanding performance because of the camaraderie and the humanness of those branches. So to answer your question, I think a leader should be concerned with the macro culture of the organization as a whole. What do they
Hmm.
stand for? What are they doing? What are the solutions that they're providing um, to their target market? And then within each branch department, then you can have micro cultures that are congruent with the macro, but have their own flavor and have the autonomy to be themselves rather than forced to be
Hmm.
something that's unnatural to them. Does that make sense?
I think that makes perfect sense. Again, in my own experience, I think the type of personality, work culture that may work very much in an IT department
Yep.
may actually be very different in a sales and marketing or indeed an HR department. They're different people, they're different personalities, they're attracted by different things, which is why they've chosen different careers. So it is inevitable, maybe, that the people, process, policy, and culture will be different in each of those areas.
Correct. Absolutely. Couldn't have put it better myself. And having worked in IT and oil and gas and different industries within account management and marketing and sales, if you ask me to sit behind the computer and deal with figures and punch them into a database, horrible. I'd get clinical depression very quickly. So you have to know what you are and what your strengths are and work with that and make the best of it, really. Yeah.
But therein is an interesting one, and it is an area that, if people have watched a couple of my podcasts, may have heard me say something like this before, because I suppose it's a sort of pet topic.
Right.
I'm cautious around leadership, and to explain my caution around leadership is that actually an awful lot of our leaders, I don't think are great. I mean, again, I'll make a reference to the post office scandal right now, but that's too topical. People forget it. But I mean, if we look at some of the leaders that have proved to be not great leaders, and we voted them into power, or we bought their products, or we put them up as leadership icons, only to later find out these are deeply dysfunctional people, potentially, psychopaths who are great at achieving a goal, but at the expense of human connection. And your story about the lady in the bank was a really interesting one to me, because I think, I don't feel the need to be the leader of my father, my brother, my mother, or my children. And I certainly don't feel that they should follow me. I think, my role is to help people be themselves, not to slavishly follow me, my thoughts, my views, my ambitions. I
Mhm.
think that's really fundamentally very wrong. And I think that type of leadership um, may be problematic. Whereas there's a really good example, and maybe this is where coaching and management come in. A manager like the lady that you talked about, who creates the environment in which people can thrive, who can speak up and who can innovate and come up with ideas and challenge thinking and improve products and provide excellent service.
Yeah.
That's the day-to-day lived experience. And that day-to-day lived experience is what's real, not what happens at head office 10,000 miles away. The sort of remote leadership I acknowledge is there, that's the global economy, but it's actually your lived experience with the colleagues around you and the team leader or the manager or frankly the girl or guy right next to you. That's actually the important thing. And that isn't leadership. That's collegiate. That's
Right.
friendship. That's being in a boat together. Nobody has to be the leader to do that. Indeed, the
Correct.
minute one of you is better than all the others, or really sees themselves as such, probably is the point at which the team fragments.
Spot on. And I think you're right in the sense that that autonomy that people benefit from is very much obviously beneficial, but it's something that Gen Zs as a generation as a whole crave. To be autonomous in their work, to go, they're clear about what they need to do, but then they're left to their own devices to go and do it and be comfortable doing it. I think that's really necessary in today's work environment, where you state what is asked of them. Here are the resources, here's some extra resources, and here's support. What else do you need? How can I help you do your job better? Let me know, but I'm here as support. Off you go. And I think that's something really that high performing teams and organizations these days are demonstrating, that it does work and it gives us great return. Now, of course, you have the national culture, the geographical regions of the world where that autonomy may not necessarily work well. So having worked in the Middle East, it's not always beneficial because it's a different culture entirely. Whereas in Chicago or Miami, it might work brilliantly, or in the UK. So you have to be mindful of how regional cultures can play a role within organizations, or different branches in different countries and cultures play a very big role in that.
I'd like to explore that idea of regional culture and maybe start it with something that's not necessarily regional, but market. I was listening to an excellent podcast where the guy who was in charge of HR when LinkedIn was a couple of hundred people
Yeah.
made an interesting observation. He said, no one's going to last here. People come here, make a pile, do great stuff, leave. On the basis that no one's going to be here for more than 3 years, the idea that we would nurture people and that they would grow with the organization and over a 10, 20-year period, make a profound impact. All of that gets pushed to one side. We need people that will learn incredibly fast because we know they're not going to be here that long. And so the recruitment strategy started shifting towards fast learners rather than deep learners, people who will get to grips with a changing environment incredibly quickly, rather than somebody who has 20, 25 years lived experience, but obviously has taken a long, long time to accumulate that. They're not going to accumulate that in LinkedIn. Length of tenure is only maybe 3 years.
Right.
And so we'll see there that whether it's an intent or whether it's a recognition of a set of circumstance that drives a slightly different intent, we recruit for different things nowadays. And the extent to which we recruit for knowledge or even thinking compared to, say, compliance and fast learning, that's really interesting. And it clearly appears to happen in different industries. And I'm wondering to what extent it happens in different cultures.
That's a good point. But I mean, bear in mind, you just took the example of LinkedIn, which is Silicon Valley, and you've got the IT industry, which is the most hyper fast industry in the world
Mm.
today. But if you look at a finance house, say in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, the culture there isn't just short term. It's very much you're here to not only do your job, but this is your career for your life, ideally. So it's more long term, it's more tolerant, and they've got the resources to provide that luxury, of course. Whereas in the West, or a private organization, it might be a lot more competitive. And the return on your investment as an organization into people has to be very high, very quickly. So I think the priorities are very different. And the value system is quite different as well. 50 years ago, if you worked for Toyota in Japan, you worked for Toyota. That was your life. That was your career. That was your family. That was your assurance for the rest of your life that you are a Toyota employee. I think that's missing today. And I could be a bit controversial with that. The risk factor of going to a new job, and how redundant you are and how temporary you can be, that fear and anxiety that it produces, the concern for safety all the time. What do I need? What if I lose my job? What if I need to then, find a different job? That in the background is causing anxiety among a lot of people. And I've talked to a lot of people recently who are in the age bracket of 40 to 25. They would love to have security and safety, but at the same time, they want to feel free rather than tied down. They want that autonomy, but they also want that, it would be so nice if I could have a job and not worry about how redundant I can be in 2 years and how volatile everything is and how quickly I could just get the sack and panic again.
I think there's a well-known quote linked to Richard Branson that says, what if we train our staff and they leave? To which the response is, of course, well, what if we don't and they stay? And I think one of the challenges nowadays is we're increasingly, and you mentioned this in the context of Silicon Valley, we're increasingly looking at yield. Okay. How much does this employee cost? How much will I make off the back of it? Now, in the consulting world, that yield is literally financial. You're looking for a sort of 60, maybe 70% markup. But in other areas, you're looking at productivity rather than that, like price markup. And this pursuit of yield can create dysfunctional thinking. It can actually stifle innovation. If you're
innovate or else.
Yeah.
Come up with something great, incredible, right now. Otherwise, you lose your job. And with that fear and anxiety in the background, will you have the right brain chemistry to go and innovate? Not really. You're constantly in a state of fight, flight. In the background, your amygdala is flaring up and saying, oh my God, I haven't thought of a solution. I haven't innovated anything. Oh my God, I'm not as clever as Elon Musk. What do I do? And this is where I think a lot of products and services today, going back to the Japanese Kaizen theory of continuous improvement, which is wonderful. And I think it's something to strive for and constantly improve yourself. Are we really improving though? Or are we just changing the outfit and adding more bells and whistles that are not adding value, but it just looks nice because it's the new edition or the latest thing? Take cars, for example. Nowadays, there is so much technology in them. There's so much unnecessary technology in them, if you ask me. I rented a car recently, which was, let's just say, from the East. Wonderful car, reliable, safe, efficient, comfortable, warm. Everything ticked the box. The only problem was it's kept making warning sounds all the time about something. There was so much technology in it that was unnecessary sometimes, for the greater safety of my driving. So people's expectations are more, and it's nice to deliver and meet their expectations. But are we innovating and creating for the sake of innovation and creation, or are we naturally and are we really solving problems that exist? That's a really good question I think one has to ask when they're innovating, when they're striving to make something better. Are you making it better, or are you just making it look a bit sexier? And that wanes off after a few months. And, it's again, does that make sense?
It does. I think you're absolutely spot on. I think one of the challenges of style over substance and a phrase lifted from banking is, are we weighing the pig or fattening the pig? In pursuit of dashboards and graphs and, beauty and aesthetics, we actually stop looking at the thing underneath. In technology, there's a sort of word used for technical debt. And
Yep.
this is all the things that you should have been doing to maintain the thing, but you neglected them because they're not actually profitable. It's a bit like saying, I've saved money by not doing the repairs to my house. And then eventually the house falls down, and maybe that saving was an artificial saving. And we're seeing these artificial savings in government spend. We're seeing these artificial savings in organizations that neglect training and development and coaching and support. But they will pursue breakdance, lovely bar charts. So the presentation layer is excellent, but maybe the execution layer and certainly the core product, sometimes it's quite weak. And
Yeah.
controversially, somebody said something recently. I'm not sure I 100% agree with it, but it's an interesting thought. Have we actually really invented anything new recently, or are we just perfecting what we already had? I mean, the iPhone, for example, fantastic phone, but we've had telephones now for well over 100 years. Is it merely a perfection of the thing that we already have? The point that you made about the car is another excellent example. The current car is a fantastic piece of kit, but it's really only a perfection of something that we already had. Perhaps AI is the only thing that we just didn't have even conceptually 100 years ago.
True, but it's also but before we get into AI, not that I know much about it, so I have to be a bit cautious about how much I pretend I know. Let's go back to what you said with respect to everything has to look shiny and sexy and new and all that. The same can be, you can notice the same echoing in social media with how we are obsessed with aesthetics, beauty, filters, perfection, and the problems it's breeding within society, with insecurities, with this beauty, body dysmorphia and whatnot, and how it leads to more consumerism because we try to buy pleasure rather than focusing on cultivating happiness within our lives. So you look at most young people these days, and I say young as in, the millennials and Gen Zs, and the levels of depression and anxiety among them has never been this high. Between 30 and 40-year-olds, the baseline anxiety they wake up with in the morning, baseline, that is, Tim, baseline, is higher than people who were in mental hospitals in the 1950s. This is from a recent report, because there is constant comparison to other people. Am I good enough? Am I sexy enough? Am I attractive enough? Am I worthy enough? And what do I need to do to feel that void and gap being filled? What do I need to do? What do I need to purchase and consume in order to get that dopamine high and go back down again? And the same set of values are echoed in the corporate world with what do we need to do to look good rather than meaningfully offer value to our internal and external clients and customers. So yeah, I mean, whether AI is the solution or not, AI has the potential to do a lot of good, but it can also have the potential to do a lot of bad. I think it's a question of who's running the AI. It's no different to electricity, really, in a very raw sense. You can use electricity to power a hospital, or you could torture someone with it. The intention behind it has to be noble. But in a world where there is duality, you have to be mindful of the dark that exists and how it can manifest itself in various different ugly forms that can deteriorate our lives even more.
I'd certainly agree that AI has a potential in two different directions. Insofar as you might argue that AI is an accelerant, and if you're pointing towards the edge of a cliff, accelerating towards it may not necessarily be the best thing for you. But I think there's an interesting thing, thought experiment from Daniel Schmachtenberger, who said, actually, technology has morals. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. How does that work? And so he explains very simplistically, but stacks it. And he says, look, if you and I are both planting stuff in a field, doing back-breaking labor, and you're smart and you invent a plow, Okay, and now suddenly you can do twice as much work in half the amount of time and finish early. The question is, do you finish early, or do you think actually there's an opportunity to stockpile here? And
Mm,
the answer is most of the time you sit there and go, actually, I'm going to stockpile here, okay, and I can accumulate wealth. And of course, I'm going to watch that and I'm going to sit there and go, well, I'm going to carry on doing backgroping work, or am I going to adopt the same technology? And of
mm,
course, I will adopt the same technology. I'm not going to see you advantage to me just sit there and go, oh, I'm not going to do this. So then I will adopt that technology. And implicit in that technology is that it's morally the right thing to do. Okay. And then, of course, you have a sword and I have a machine gun, and you're sat there going, I'm not going to get very far with this sword. Okay. And the sword may have been satisfactory, but you know what? I'm going to adopt the machine gun. And
mhm,
maybe I'll adopt the moral narrative that says I'm here to defend myself. So I adopt that piece of technology. Okay. Even if you have no intention of realistically using it, but
mhm.
if you don't use it, you're going to lose. And so you're buying that as an insurance. And the argument is if we keep rolling this forward, every piece of technology almost becomes obligatory. If somebody else has got it, you have to have it too, you know.
Yeah.
And if we keep doing that, if we keep saying, I must have one also, and I will justify that, the technology is actually changing our morals. That's interesting.
Changing or manifesting our morals in efficient ways.
Well, arguably, is we post-rationalize. The truth of the matter is, as much as we like to think that every decision we ever made is entirely ours, the reality is that most humans will be in a set of circumstances and rationalize their decision making. And if we go into pure neuroscience, we know that the chemical reaction of decision making happens before the thought of decision making.
Mhm.
Um, and so most things are justifying ourselves, and that's probably most easily manifest in things like politics. And so when we find ourselves doing something and we justify it, is that not effectively codifying our justification? It's creating rules or society or culture or even religions. They are merely the codification of what we all agree between us.
Mhm.
Okay. And because different countries have different rules, different cultures, different religions, these are codes. They may be codes from a deity, they may be codes from people. People have different beliefs on that. But it's a moral ethical coding system that we all agree to live by, and it's changing constantly. There's no universal truth. There's nothing that's been consistent throughout all time. These rules seem to be pretty flexible over the last couple of thousand years.
To a certain extent, there are certain things, moral rules that really haven't changed. I mean, murder is murder, killing is killing. It's not good. Nobody wants to do that. And there are reasons and justifications that people come up with, of course. And I respect that. Sometimes it's necessary. History has proven that to us. And generally, the good prevails. But
Mm.
through that prevailing, there is a lot of collateral damage and harm. Are you getting into the area that truth is very subjective?
I think it is. I mean, there's a really interesting quote that truth is what everyone else lets you get away with. And
There's not truth then. That's what you're getting away with.
truth was written by the victors in history is another quote.
True. It doesn't make it true though. It's a
So what
perception
is
and a
what is
perspective.
truth? What is truth? Now, obviously, at that point, then we can start looking at science, and we can start saying, but even science doesn't know what's true; it just knows what's not true. The whole of science
Well,
is debunking that. That is not the case. We can't say
I
what is
understand.
true, but we can say what is not true. Um,
Okay.
so,
Let's keep it really simple for our
hmm,
audience. What's 2 plus 2? It's 4. There's no that's a truth. That is a fact.
hmm,
2 plus 2 is 4. And a spade is a spade.
hmm.
um, if we overthink, sometimes we invite doubt. And I think doubt can be uh, it brings its own set of problems with it too. And I think sometimes it's nice to go back to raw facts. Um, I'm not sure how I want to say this. Bear with. Something in me is very uncomfortable with the term, which became very popular the last 20 years. My truth.
My truth. I agree. I agree that it's a really interesting, controversial, and it competitive. It's competitive. My truth is better than your truth. My
Yes.
belief system is better than your belief system, and there is no room for debate or discussion or nuance. And I think that
Spot
is
on.
deeply problematic.
Yes.
On the other hand, you say two and two is four, and a spade is a spade. Well, actually, if you're an accountant, we can make an asset look like a liability. We can make a profit look like a loss. We can change numbers. Numbers are purely symbolic, and a spade may be a shovel. It may be a weapon. It could
Mhm.
be used for planting trees. It may be very, very good. And of course, we see the gun lobby in America say things like guns don't kill people. People do. So therefore, a gun has no morals, has no ethics, has nothing. It's just an object. There's
Mhm.
nothing implicit in that gun.
You can say the same about fire or a knife.
Exactly, exactly. But that's my point. So then you get into this my truth type thing, and it's an interesting, controversial, and difficult spiral. And I do worry about my truth, but I'm curious and I'm prepared to tolerate ambiguity. And actually, if you look at, for example, and I've referred to it to a couple of times, this post office scandal, you could turn around and say the truth is what the judge and the jury agreed, and we sent them to prison, and that is the truth. And
Mhm.
now we're seeing lots of these things being overturned and saying, well, no, that wasn't the truth.
Well,
Okay.
that's the
It
thing.
was what we believed at the time, but it wasn't the
Yes,
truth.
exactly. It was a perception, it was an understanding that labeled it as, therefore, it's truth.
Mm.
But the truth is objective, it's not subjective. My perception of witnessing a car accident is very different to yours. Our perceptions give us our reality.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean if we factually look at what happened, we need, you can't ignore what happened, even if it is contrary to your own perception, which is, if you look at sports, right? A football match or a tennis match at Wimbledon, why are cameras used now compared to 20, 30 years ago? So, so well, because it is objective. The position of the referee might be different, but the moment they rerun it on the camera, there's no doubt that's where the ball hit. It was on this side of the line versus that side of the line. And that determines the judgment because it is objective. It is not corrupted by any one person's perception or angle or vantage point.
Mhm.
And I think that's something we need to respect and return to rather than my truth versus your truth. I think that
I
is
agree, and
yeah.
but I also, posit that it's a deeply complex
Oh,
topic
very.
because, for example, um, so as a coach and as somebody who's involved in therapy,
Yeah.
I read and have studied court transcripts and, how you need to look after people who are victims of trauma and how certain questions that lawyers can use can be persuasive, leading questions.
Yeah.
So, for example, if I said, how fast was the car rolling forward when it bumped into the dustbin? Okay, tell me roughly what you think, how fast it was going. You're going to come up with a low number.
Mm.
If I sit there and go, how fast was the car rushing as it smashed into the dustbin?
Yes.
Okay,
Leading.
whatever number you think of, it's going to be bigger than the first one.
Yes.
And so we know that there is a truth. The car evidently at some stage or other touched the dustbin. Whether it bumped into it, rolled into it, smashed into it, we can completely change the narrative. And we see this in courts. And whilst we might turn around and say the court made a decision, actually, the British justice system, more than, for example, the French, which is more administrative, the British justice system is purely adversarial. Okay, which one of us can argue a better truth? Okay, the truth itself is almost incidental. Who's got the best barrister? Now, that is actually different from justice systems elsewhere in the world.
And who can afford the better barrister?
And I think that's interesting. And I, I, I wouldn't say, so I don't disagree with you about something that's deeply concerning about the rise of Trumpism and saying, well, this is Trump's truth, or Weinstein, or any of these people who would manipulate circumstances to fit a narrative. And frankly, we see this in history, and we're speaking in 2024, and there are conflicts at the moment in Ukraine, Syria still ongoing, and clearly Israel and Gaza. And our interpretation of history and our understanding of what's right or wrong is, as you rightly say, is very much consumed by our perceptions, our experience, our lived history, our circumstances, whether we were there, whether we are taking information from first, second, or third order sources.
Or TikTok.
It's really difficult.
Yeah. Or TikTok, and how social media might edit certain things out of context, which then formulates your perception and your reality of how awful the world is versus how, we're doing all right. Things are not that bad. I think we have to be very mindful of where we are consuming our content, whether it's your food and your drink or your media information as well, and regain that critical thinking within yourself to formulate a perception that would serve you at this particular time in your life. What the other thing I'm wary of, going back to a macro broad stroke here, is we have created also an attention economy. And the most valuable commodity in this economy is victimhood. In the 17th century, Rene Descartes coined the most elegant phrase, "I think, therefore I am." We've downgraded that into, "I'm a victim, therefore I am." And I think that in itself is also cultivating a rise in Munchausen syndrome, and everybody focusing on doom and gloom and how awful it is for me because I am this or because I am that. I think this is a drama triangle that's never going to materialize into anything constructive or positive in your life. And I think you need to be, as an individual, wary and cautious with how you view yourself, because if you go out into the world and believe that it is rigged against you, your life will manifest that. You are what you believe. So be very mindful of your belief system and cleanse some of the limiting beliefs and habits that you have formulated unconsciously. Consciously get out of your own way and realize that the world is not conspiring against you. Things are okay, and you can go and have and create a meaningful life and find joy and purpose to have a reason to wake up every morning and look forward to whatever challenges the day might have.
I think that's brilliant advice, and it comes at 1 hour in, and I think a fantastic point to sort of close on, because I think that's a really good and positive message that's really useful. And one of the things that I'd like to do with these podcasts is share interesting conversations, and this, without doubt, has been broad, wide-ranging, interesting.
Thank you. Yes, it's been a pleasure.
On the fringe of controversial at times.
Very much so. And there were certain parts where I was very cautious not to go down, because it's very easy in today's world where people can choose a certain piece from this podcast and add their own narrative and complain about it. But again, both our intentions are good. We're not here to harm anyone. We're not here to backstab anyone or flare anyone's feelings. We're just having a general chat about how there's good and bad everywhere, and it's good to reclaim your own sovereignty to critically think and find and decide what works for you to live a better life and just create a little bit of improvement, just a tiny shift, because that'll yield a better return. So 5% improvement, 30% return, so to speak.
Well, hopefully this podcast for some people will have been that thing, that little bit of mental shift, something
I hope so.
Inspires them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much indeed.